Picture this. It's the morning of June 27th, 1977. Duluth, Minnesota. The fog rolls in thick off Lake Superior, wrapping around a sprawling, red brick mansion perched on the shoreline like a shroud. Glensheen, 39 rooms, 27,000 square feet of carved oak and leaded glass, sitting on 12 pristine acres. From the outside, it looks untouched by time. A monument to America's Gilded Age, when fortunes were made overnight and families built palaces to prove it. But inside, on this particular morning, something has gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. A nurse arrives for her shift at 6 a.m. She walks through the grand entrance hall, past the oil paintings, the Persian rugs, the marble fireplace, and climbs the stairs to check on her patient. What she finds will shatter the illusion of old money grace forever. 2 women are dead, murdered. One beaten with a brass candlestick, the other smothered with a satin pillow. And the victim in the bed, 83 years old, partially paralyzed, unable to defend herself, is Elizabeth Congdon, heiress to one of Minnesota's greatest fortunes. This is not a story about a robbery gone wrong. This is a story about what happens when wealth, inheritance, and desperation collide. About the dark, hidden machinery behind a family fortune. About a mansion that was meant to symbolize success and ended up becoming a crime scene. If you're the kind of person who wants more than surface-level history, who wants to understand the real human cost behind grand estates and gilded lives, then you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment if you want more deep investigations into the stories behind America's most famous houses. Because this one goes deeper than you think. Let's start at the beginning. The man who built an empire. To understand what happened at Glensheen in 1977, you have to go back 70 years to a time when Duluth, Minnesota, was one of the busiest ports in America, and fortunes were being pulled out of the earth in the form of iron ore. Chester Congdon was born in 1853 in Rochester, New York. His father was a lawyer and Methodist minister, respectable but not wealthy. Chester was brilliant. He graduated from Syracuse University, then earned a law degree from the University of Michigan. In 1881, he moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, and began practicing law. But Chester wasn't interested in a quiet legal career. He wanted more, and he saw opportunity where others saw only wilderness. Minnesota's Iron Range, the stretch of land in the northeastern part of the state, was rich with ore. The kind of ore that would fuel America's industrial revolution. Railroads, skyscrapers, bridges, ships. All of it needed steel, and steel needed iron. Chester Congdon didn't dig the ore out himself. He didn't swing a pickaxe or operate a mine. What he did was far more lucrative. He made the deals. He structured the financing. He acquired the mineral rights. He brokered the mergers. He became the legal and financial architect behind some of the largest mining operations in the region. By the early 1900s, Chester Congdon was one of the wealthiest men in Minnesota. He had interests in dozens of mines, railroads, and timber companies. He sat on the boards of banks. He owned land across the state, and he wanted a house that reflected his success, a house that would stand as a symbol of everything he had built. In 1905, Chester purchased 12 acres of prime lakefront property in Duluth, perched on the cliffs overlooking Lake Superior. He hired the best architects he could find. Clarence Johnston, the most prominent architect in Minnesota at the time, known for designing state institutions and grand private homes. Together, they designed Glensheen. The name came from the Scottish words glen, meaning valley, and sheen, meaning beautiful. Chester's wife, Clara, had Scottish roots, and the name was meant to evoke the rolling estates of the old world, places where wealth was inherited, not earned, places where families had deep roots and long histories. But Chester Congdon wasn't born into that world. He built his way into it, and now he was going to build a house that would outlast him. Building the dream. Construction on Glensheen began in 1905 and took 3 years to complete. This was not a quick project. This was not a simple home. Chester Congdon wanted perfection, and he was willing to pay for it. The mansion was designed in the Jacobean Revival style. an architectural mode inspired by English country estates of the early 17th century. Think steeply pitched roofs, gabled windows, decorative chimneys, and intricate brickwork. The exterior was clad in red brick, with stone trim and clay roof tiles imported from Europe. Every detail mattered. Every material was chosen for its quality and durability. Inside, the mansion was a showcase of craftsmanship. The grand staircase was carved from oak, each baluster hand-turned. The library featured built-in bookshelves, a massive fireplace, and a coffered ceiling. The breakfast room had hand-painted canvas murals depicting idyllic landscapes. There was a billiard room, a music room, a reception hall, and a formal dining room that could seat 20 guests. 15 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, a full basement with servant quarters, a kitchen, laundry facilities, and storage rooms. But Glensheen wasn't just about the interior. Chester wanted the grounds to be equally impressive. He hired the Morell and Nichols landscape architecture firm to design the gardens. They created terraced lawns, formal flower beds, a bowling green, a clay tennis court, and winding pathways lined with native trees and imported shrubs. There was a carriage house, a gardener's cottage, a boathouse, and even a dock extending into Lake Superior. The total cost? Estimates vary, but it's believed Chester Congdon spent around $850,000 on the mansion and grounds, equivalent to roughly $25 million today. And that's just the construction. Furnishing the place, maintaining it, staffing it. That was an ongoing expense that required serious wealth. Which brings us to an uncomfortable question. Where did all that money actually come from? Chester Congdon's fortune was built on iron ore. But let's be clear about what that means. He didn't discover the ore. He didn't mine it. He didn't smelt it. What Chester did was control the legal and financial structures that allowed other people to extract it. He was a middleman, a very, very wealthy middleman. The Iron Range was a brutal place to work. Miners, many of them immigrants from Finland, Italy, and Eastern Europe, worked long hours in dangerous conditions for low wages. Cave-ins, explosions, accidents. These were common. The companies that owned the mines prioritized production over safety. And the legal frameworks that Chester helped build? They protected the companies, not the workers. You could argue that Chester was just doing his job, that he was a lawyer and businessman operating within the system of his time. And that's true. But it's also true that his wealth was built on a system that extracted value from the land and the labor of others, while funneling the profits upward to men like him. And that wealth allowed him to build Glensheen, a place of beauty, comfort, and stability, a place where his family could live in luxury, shielded from the harsh realities that paid for it. Chester and Clara had 7 children. They raised them at Glensheen, in an environment of privilege and refinement. The children were educated, traveled, and groomed for roles in Minnesota's elite social circles. This was old money in the making, wealth that would be passed down, managed, preserved. But here's the thing about wealth. It doesn't guarantee happiness. It doesn't protect you from tragedy. And it doesn't stop people from wanting more. The heiress, Elizabeth Congdon, was born in 1894, the third of Chester and Clara's 7 children. She grew up at Glensheen, surrounded by beauty and privilege. She was educated, cultured, and kind. By all accounts, a thoughtful and generous person. But Elizabeth's life was also marked by hardship. In her 20s, she contracted polio, which left her with physical limitations. She never married. She never had biological children. And as her siblings married and moved away, Elizabeth remained at Glensheen, living with her aging parents and eventually becoming the primary caretaker of the estate. When Chester Congdon died in 1916, his fortune was divided among his children, but Elizabeth inherited Glensheen itself, along with a significant portion of the family's wealth. When Clara died in 1950, Elizabeth became the sole owner of the mansion and the primary steward of the Congdon fortune. Elizabeth could have lived a quiet, insular life, but she didn't. She was active in her community. She supported the arts, education, and healthcare. She donated generously to causes she believed in. And in 1932, she made a decision that would have profound consequences. She adopted 2 daughters. Their names were Jennifer and Marjorie. Jennifer was adopted as an infant. Marjorie was adopted when she was a toddler, after her biological mother, a young unmarried woman, gave her up. Elizabeth raised both girls at Glensheen, giving them every advantage: private schools, travel, social connections, and eventually trust funds. But Marjorie was different. From an early age, she exhibited troubling behavior. She was impulsive. She lied frequently. She had difficulty forming genuine relationships. As she grew older, she became increasingly reckless with money, constantly in debt despite her trust fund. She married multiple times, each marriage turbulent and short-lived. She had children, but struggled to maintain stable relationships with them. Elizabeth loved her daughter. She bailed her out financially, time and time again. She tried to help. But Marjorie's problems only seemed to deepen. And then, in 1976, Elizabeth received a chilling warning. The warning. By the mid-1970s, Marjorie Congdon Caldwell was living in Colorado with her fifth husband, Roger Caldwell. Roger was a former mining executive, but his career had stalled. The couple was drowning in debt. They owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to creditors, and their lifestyle, expensive cars, lavish spending, was completely unsustainable. Marjorie had a trust fund, but it wasn't enough. She wanted more. She wanted control of her mother's fortune. And according to a report filed by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, she wanted something else, too. In 1976, investigators in Colorado learned that Marjorie had been asking around about hiring a hitman. She wanted someone to kill her mother. The information was credible enough that the Colorado authorities contacted the trustees of Elizabeth Congdon's estate to warn them. They told the trustees that Marjorie posed a potential threat to her mother's life. The trustees were horrified. They took the warning seriously. They increased security at Glensheen. They limited Marjorie's access to Elizabeth. And they waited. But nothing happened. Months passed. Elizabeth remained safe at Glensheen, cared for by a rotating staff of nurses. She was 83 years old, partially paralyzed from stroke, and confined to a wheelchair. She was vulnerable, but she was protected. Until she wasn't. The night of the murders. June 26, 1977. A Sunday evening. Glensheen is quiet. Elizabeth Congdon is in her bedroom on the second floor, attended by her night nurse, Velma Petola. Velma is 66 years old, a reliable and experienced caregiver who has worked for the Congdon family for years. The rest of the household staff has gone home for the night. The mansion is locked. The grounds are dark. Sometime around 2 or 3 a.m., an intruder enters the mansion. The exact method of entry is unclear, possibly through a basement window that had been left unlocked. The intruder moves through the house. Velma Petola hears something. She leaves Elizabeth's bedroom to investigate. She encounters the intruder on the staircase. What happens next is brutal and swift. The intruder attacks Velma with a brass candlestick, striking her repeatedly. Velma fights back. There are defensive wounds on her hands and arms, but she is overpowered. She is beaten to death on the staircase landing. The intruder then goes upstairs to Elizabeth's bedroom. Elizabeth is awake, but she cannot move, cannot defend herself. The intruder takes a satin pillow and presses it over her face. Elizabeth Congdon is suffocated to death in her own bed. The intruder searches the house. A few items are taken, a small amount of jewelry, including a Byzantine gold coin. But most of the valuables, silverware, art, expensive antiques, are left untouched. Then the intruder leaves. The mansion is silent again. At 6 a.m., another nurse arrives for her shift. She finds the front door ajar. She walks inside and discovers Velma's body. She runs upstairs and finds Elizabeth. She calls the police. When the Duluth police arrived at Glensheen that morning, they walked into a scene that didn't make sense. 2 women brutally killed. A mansion full of priceless items, but almost nothing taken. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of ransacking. Just 2 bodies and a few pieces of missing jewelry. The initial theory was simple: a robbery gone wrong. Someone broke in, was surprised by the nurse, panicked, killed her, then killed Elizabeth to eliminate a witness. But the detectives on the scene weren't convinced. The level of violence was extreme. Velma had been beaten savagely. This wasn't a panicked reaction. This was rage. And Elizabeth had been smothered methodically, deliberately. There was no struggle because she couldn't struggle. Whoever did this knew she was helpless. And then there was the question of what wasn't stolen. The mansion was filled with silver artwork, antiques worth thousands of dollars. Why take a single gold coin and a few small pieces of jewelry, but leave everything else? As the investigation unfolded, the police began to look inward, not at strangers or drifters, but at the family itself. Follow the money. Detectives started by asking a basic question. Who benefits from Elizabeth Congdon's death? The answer was immediate and clear. Her daughters. Jennifer Congdon Johnson, the older of the two adopted daughters, was financially stable. She had her own life, her own family, and no apparent motive. She cooperated fully with investigators and was quickly ruled out. But Marjorie Congdon Caldwell? She was a different story. Marjorie and her husband Roger were in dire financial straits. They owed money to banks, credit card companies, and private lenders. Their spending was wildly out of control. They lived in a fantasy world of wealth they didn't actually possess. And they were running out of options. Under the terms of Elizabeth's will, Marjorie stood to inherit millions. Estimates put her share at over $8 million, equivalent to roughly $40 million today. But Elizabeth was still alive, and the trustees controlled the purse strings. Marjorie couldn't access that money. Not yet. Police also learned about the 1976 warning from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the report that Marjorie had been asking about hiring a hitman. The pieces were starting to come together. But there was a problem. Marjorie had an alibi. On the night of the murders, she and Roger were in Colorado, 900 miles away from Duluth. Or so they claimed. Investigators dug deeper. The evidence against Roger Caldwell. Roger Caldwell became the focus of the investigation. Detectives discovered that he had flown from Colorado to Minneapolis on June 26th, the day before the murders. He had rented a car. He had driven to Duluth. And then, after the murders, he had driven back to Minneapolis, returned the rental car, and flown back to Colorado, all in less than 24 hours. Roger claimed he had been in Colorado the entire time. But the paper trail told a different story. Airline records, rental car receipts, gas station purchases. It all pointed to Roger being in Minnesota on the night of June 26th. Then came the physical evidence. A few weeks after the murders, a package arrived at Roger and Marjorie's home in Colorado. Inside was a small velvet pouch containing a Byzantine gold coin, one of the items stolen from Glensheen. The package had been mailed from Duluth, Minnesota, on June 27th, the day after the murders. But here's the twist. The package was addressed to Roger Caldwell. He had mailed it to himself. Police obtained a search warrant and examined the coin. They found a single fingerprint on it, Roger's fingerprint. Roger was arrested on July 6, 1977, and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The first trial, Roger Caldwell. Roger Caldwell's trial began in April 1978 in Brainerd, Minnesota. The prosecution laid out a methodical case: motive, money, opportunity. Roger was in Duluth, and evidence: the stolen coin with his fingerprint, the travel records, the injuries on his hands. Roger's defense was weak. He claimed he had been in Colorado the entire time, but couldn't explain the airline and rental car records. He said someone must have planted the coin. He said his injuries, scratches and bruises on his hands and face, were from a fall. But none of it held up under scrutiny. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On July 8, 1978, they returned a verdict: guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Roger Caldwell was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. But the story wasn't over. Because while Roger had been convicted of committing the murders, most people believed he hadn't acted alone. The question everyone was asking was, did Marjorie plan it? The second trial, Marjorie Caldwell. In 1979, Marjorie Congdon Caldwell was charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Marjorie had orchestrated the murders, and Roger had carried them out. She provided the motive, the planning, and the inside knowledge. He provided the physical act. But proving conspiracy is difficult. There was no direct evidence that Marjorie had told Roger to kill her mother. No phone records explicitly laying out a plan. No witnesses who heard her say the words. The case rested on circumstantial evidence, the financial desperation, the 1976 Hitman inquiry, the fact that Marjorie stood to inherit millions, and the suspicious behavior before and after the murders. Marjorie's defense attorney, Ronald Meshbesher, was one of the best criminal defense lawyers in Minnesota. He was charismatic, strategic, and relentless. And he understood something crucial. In a conspiracy trial, you don't have to prove your client is innocent. You just have to create reasonable doubt. Meshbesher painted Marjorie as a victim. He portrayed her as a troubled woman, yes, but not a murderer. He pointed out that she had been in Colorado at the time of the murders. He argued that the prosecution's case was built on speculation and bias. He suggested that Roger had acted alone, driven by his own desperation, and that Marjorie had no knowledge of his plans. And then there was Marjorie herself. Throughout the trial, she presented a calm, sympathetic image. She dressed conservatively. She knitted quietly in the courtroom, a detail that became infamous. She appeared composed, even demure. To some jurors, she didn't look like someone capable of orchestrating a double murder. On July 21, 1979, after 2 weeks of deliberations, the jury returned a verdict: not guilty. Marjorie Caldwell walked free. Public reaction. The verdict stunned Minnesota. Many people believed Marjorie was guilty, that she had manipulated Roger, planned the murders, and then escaped justice through skillful lawyering and a sympathetic courtroom performance. Editorial pages condemned the verdict. Victims' rights advocates called for changes in conspiracy laws. The Congdon family was devastated. But legally, Marjorie was free. Double jeopardy meant she could never be tried again for the same crime. She had won. Or had she? While Marjorie walked free, Roger Caldwell sat in a Minnesota prison cell, serving 2 consecutive life sentences. But his lawyers weren't giving up. They filed appeals, arguing that errors had been made during his trial, errors significant enough to warrant a new trial. In 1982, 5 years after the murders, the Minnesota Court of Appeals overturned Roger's conviction. The court ruled that certain evidence had been improperly admitted and that Roger's constitutional rights had been violated. The state had the option to retry him, but by this point, the case was complicated. Witnesses had died or moved away. Evidence had degraded. Memories had faded. And there was a real risk that a second trial would end in acquittal. So the prosecution made a deal. In 1983, Roger Caldwell was offered a plea bargain, plead guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder, and he would be sentenced to time already served. He would be released immediately. Roger took the deal. On July 5, 1983, he stood in a courtroom and confessed. He admitted that he had killed Elizabeth Congdon and Velma Petola. He described entering the mansion, attacking the nurse, and suffocating the elderly woman in her bed. He said he had acted alone. He said Marjorie had nothing to do with it. Then he walked out of the courthouse a free man. The confession and the questions. Roger's confession should have closed the case, but it didn't, because no one believed him. Legal experts, journalists, investigators, and members of the public all questioned the confession. Why would Roger take full responsibility and exonerate Marjorie? The most likely explanation: he loved her, or he was afraid of her, or he had been promised something: money, support, a future together. Or perhaps he simply wanted it to be over. But the confession had legal power. It meant that Marjorie could never be charged again. Roger had taken a fall, and she was protected. For 5 years, Roger lived quietly in Pennsylvania and later in Colorado. He worked odd jobs. He drank heavily. He struggled with depression. And on May 18, 1988, Roger Caldwell was found dead in his apartment. He had shot himself in the head. Suicide. He left no note. No explanation. Just a life that ended in isolation and despair. Marjorie's life after the trials. If you're hoping for a story where Marjorie Caldwell learned her lesson, reformed, and lived a quiet life, you're going to be disappointed. Because Marjorie's troubles were just beginning. After her acquittal, Marjorie remarried twice. Her sixth husband was Wallace Hagan, a retired logger. They lived in Ajo, Arizona, a small desert town. And in 1991, Marjorie was arrested and charged with arson. Investigators believed she had set fire to her home to collect insurance money. She was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. While in prison, she was also investigated for the 1992 death of Wallace Hagan, who died under suspicious circumstances. Authorities suspected foul play, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge her. Marjorie was released from prison in 2004 after serving 11 years. She moved to Tucson, Arizona. And in 2007, at the age of 74, she was arrested again, this time for fraud. She had been writing bad checks and scamming elderly victims out of money. She pleaded guilty and was sentenced to probation. Throughout all of this, Marjorie maintained her innocence regarding her mother's murder. She gave occasional interviews, always portraying herself as a victim of circumstance, bad luck, and overzealous prosecutors. She claimed she had been unfairly targeted because of her wealth and her name. Most of her children became estranged from her. Friends abandoned her. But Marjorie never seemed to reflect, never seemed to show genuine remorse for anything. She died in 2020 at the age of 87 in a Tucson assisted living facility. The official cause of death was not made public. Her obituary was brief. There were no public memorials, no outpouring of sympathy, just the quiet end of a life that had been defined by scandal, suspicion, and tragedy. The mansion endures. While the Congdon family unraveled, Glensheen itself had a different fate. In 1968, more than a decade before the murders, Elizabeth Congdon had made a remarkable decision. She donated the mansion and its grounds to the University of Minnesota Duluth, with the stipulation that it be preserved as a historic site. Elizabeth understood something important. The mansion was bigger than her family. It was a piece of Minnesota history, a monument to the Gilded Age, and a work of architectural and artistic significance. She wanted it to be protected, maintained, and shared with the public. The university accepted the gift, and in 1979, just 2 years after the murders, Glensheen opened to the public as a museum. It was a controversial decision. Some people thought it was too soon, that the mansion was tainted by the murders, that it would become a macabre tourist attraction. But the university moved forward, emphasizing the mansion's history, architecture, and the Congdon family's contributions to Minnesota, not the tragedy. And it worked. Glensheen became one of the most visited historic homes in Minnesota. Tens of thousands of people tour it every year. They walk through the grand entrance hall, admire the carved oak staircase, explore the formal gardens, and learn about Chester Congdon's life and the era in which he built his fortune. The murders are acknowledged. There's a section of the tour that addresses them, but they don't define the mansion. Glensheen has outlived the scandal. It has outlived the family, and it stands today as a testament to both the grandeur and the dark complexities of American wealth. What the mansion reveals. So what do we take away from all of this? What does Glensheen and the tragedy that unfolded within its walls tell us about wealth, power, and family in America? First, it reminds us that wealth does not protect you from human frailty. Chester Congdon built an empire and a mansion that was meant to last for generations. But within 2 generations, that fortune became a source of greed, desperation, and violence. Money doesn't solve problems. Sometimes it creates them. Second, it shows us the hidden costs of fortunes built on extraction. Chester Congdon's wealth came from iron ore that was dug out of the earth by immigrant laborers working in dangerous conditions for low pay. Glensheen was built with that money. The beauty, the craftsmanship, the elegance, it all rests on a foundation of exploitation. That doesn't make the mansion less beautiful, but it does complicate the story. Third, It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that justice is not always served. Marjorie Caldwell was almost certainly involved in planning her mother's murder, but she was never convicted. She walked free, lived for decades, and died without ever being held accountable. Roger took the fall. Velma Petola and Elizabeth Congdon never got justice. And that's hard to accept. Finally, the story of Glensheen reminds us that places outlive people. The mansion still stands. The gardens still bloom. The rooms are still filled with light. Visitors walk through and imagine what it was like to live there, to host parties in the grand dining room, to read in the library, to look out over Lake Superior from a veranda. The tragedy is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. Glensheen endures. And in its endurance, it asks us to think about what we value, what we preserve, and what we choose to remember. The legal aftermath and unanswered questions. Even decades after the murders, legal and ethical questions linger around the case. The Congdon family's wealth, estimated at around $8 million at the time of Elizabeth's death, was eventually distributed according to her will. Marjorie received her inheritance, though much of it was quickly consumed by legal fees, debts, and her ongoing financial mismanagement. The trustees of the estate had tried to protect Elizabeth. They had received the warning from Colorado. They had increased security. But in the end, it wasn't enough. This raises a painful question. Could the murders have been prevented? Should the family have taken more drastic action? Cutting Marjorie off entirely, seeking a restraining order, or even having her institutionalized? Or would those actions have been seen as cruel and unjustified at the time? We'll never know. What we do know is that Elizabeth Congdon, by all accounts a kind and generous woman, spent her final years in fear. She knew her daughter had financial problems. She knew Marjorie was unstable. And according to some sources, she suspected that Marjorie might pose a danger. But she was also a mother who loved her child, who wanted to believe the best, and who kept trying to help. That generosity, that love, may have cost her life. Velma Petola, the forgotten victim. In the media frenzy that followed the murders, much of the attention focused on Elizabeth Congdon, the wealthy heiress, the Gilded Age mansion, the family drama. But there was another victim that night, and her story is often overlooked. Velma Petola. Velma was 66 years old. She had worked as a nurse for most of her adult life. She was reliable, professional, and deeply trusted by the Congdon family. On the night of June 26, 1977, she was simply doing her job, caring for an elderly, vulnerable patient. When she heard a noise and went to investigate, she was acting with courage and responsibility, and she was killed for it. Velma didn't die quickly or painlessly. The autopsy showed that she had been struck multiple times with a brass candlestick. She had defensive wounds, meaning she fought back. She tried to protect herself, and by extension, she tried to protect Elizabeth. But she was overpowered, and she died on the staircase landing of a mansion that wasn't even hers. Velma Petola's family received little attention, little sympathy, and no share of the Congdon fortune. She was collateral damage in someone else's scheme. And her death is a stark reminder that when the wealthy and powerful implode, it's often the people around them, the employees, the caregivers, the working class individuals just trying to make a living, who pay the highest price. The role of the media. The Glensheen murders became a media sensation almost immediately. A wealthy heiress, a grand mansion, a family scandal. It had all the elements of a made-for-TV movie. And in fact, it did become a TV movie. In 1993, CBS aired A Wilderness of Error, later followed by other dramatizations and true crime documentaries. But the media coverage also shaped public perception in ways that may have influenced the outcome of the trials. During Marjorie's trial, she was depicted in some outlets as a troubled but sympathetic figure, a woman with a difficult past, raised in privilege but never fully accepted, struggling with personal demons. Her lawyer, Ronald Meshbesher, skillfully used this narrative to humanize her in front of the jury. Roger, on the other hand, was portrayed as the actual killer, the violent, desperate man who carried out the act. There was less sympathy for him. and his conviction in 1978 was met with public approval. This dynamic raises an important question. Did Marjorie's gender, her courtroom demeanor, and the way she was framed by the media help her avoid conviction? Would a male defendant, accused of the same conspiracy, have been acquitted? We can't know for certain, but it's worth considering. The psychology of Marjorie Caldwell. Over the years, psychologists, criminologists, and true crime analysts have speculated about Marjorie Caldwell's psychological profile. While she was never officially diagnosed, at least not publicly, many experts believe she exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, sometimes referred to colloquially as sociopathy or psychopathy. The evidence is compelling. Chronic lying and manipulation. Marjorie had a lifelong pattern of deception, both in her personal relationships and financial dealings. Lack of empathy. She showed little genuine remorse or emotional connection to the suffering of others, including her own mother. Impulsivity and recklessness. Despite having a trust fund, she repeatedly made disastrous financial decisions and lived far beyond her means. Superficial charm. Those who met Marjorie often described her as initially charming and personable, able to present a likable exterior. Pattern of criminal behavior. The arson conviction, fraud charges, and repeated legal troubles suggest a consistent disregard for laws and social norms. If this assessment is accurate, it helps explain why Marjorie was able to maintain her composure during the trial, why she knitted calmly while being accused of orchestrating her mother's murder, and why she never seemed to grasp the moral weight of her actions. But it also raises a troubling question. If Marjorie did have a personality disorder, to what extent was she responsible for her actions? And to what extent was she a product of her upbringing, her adoption, and the complex dynamics of the Congdon family? These are questions without easy answers, but they're worth asking. The adoption question. Marjorie's adoption is another layer of complexity in this story. Elizabeth Congdon adopted Marjorie when she was a toddler, intending to give her a loving home and every opportunity. But adoption, especially in that era, was not well understood in terms of the potential psychological impacts, particularly when a child had experienced early trauma or instability. We don't know much about Marjorie's biological parents or her early life before the adoption. But some experts have speculated that early attachment issues, combined with the pressure of growing up in an enormously wealthy and prominent family, may have contributed to her behavioral problems. This doesn't excuse her actions, but it does complicate the narrative. Marjorie was not simply a bad seed. She was a human being shaped by genetics, environment, trauma, and choice. And the tragedy of Glensheen is, in part, the story of a family that tried to do good through adoption, generosity, and love, but couldn't overcome the darkness that lay underneath. The investigation. Piecing together the timeline. The investigation into the Glensheen murders was painstaking. Detectives had to reconstruct the movements of multiple people across multiple states, trace financial records, analyze forensic evidence, and interview dozens of witnesses. Let's walk through how they built the case. The crime scene. When police arrived at Glensheen on the morning of June 27th, they immediately began documenting the scene. Velma Petula's body was found on the second-floor landing, near the top of the main staircase. The brass candlestick, a heavy, ornate piece that normally sat on a mantel, was found nearby, covered in blood. Velma's injuries were extensive, multiple blunt force trauma wounds to the head and face. The medical examiner later determined that she had been struck at least 7 times. Elizabeth Congdon's body was found in her bedroom, lying in her bed. There were no visible signs of struggle, but a satin pillow was on the floor beside the bed. The medical examiner concluded that Elizabeth had been smothered, the pillow pressed over her face until she suffocated. Given her physical condition, she would have been unable to fight back. The mansion itself showed minimal disturbance. A window in the basement had been tampered with, possibly used as a point of entry. A few items were missing, but nothing of major value. It didn't look like a typical burglary. The victims. Investigators quickly learned that Elizabeth Congdon was an extraordinarily wealthy woman, with an estate worth millions. They also learned that her adopted daughter Marjorie had serious financial problems and a history of erratic behavior. And they learned about the 1976 warning that Marjorie had reportedly inquired about hiring someone to kill her mother. This shifted the investigation immediately. Instead of looking for a random intruder, detectives began focusing on Marjorie and her husband, Roger Caldwell. The financial trail. Detectives subpoenaed financial records for Marjorie and Roger. What they found was shocking. The couple owed over $200,000 to various creditors, equivalent to nearly $1 million today. They had maxed out credit cards, taken out loans, and were facing lawsuits. They were living in a rented house in Colorado, and they were on the verge of financial collapse. But under the terms of Elizabeth's will, Marjorie stood to inherit a significant portion of his estate, potentially enough to erase all their debts and fund their extravagant lifestyle indefinitely. Motive established. The travel records. Next, investigators pulled airline and rental car records. They discovered that Roger Caldwell had purchased a plane ticket from Denver to Minneapolis on June 26th, the day before the murders. He had flown under his own name. He had rented a car at the Minneapolis airport. And then, late on June 27th, he had returned the car and flown back to Denver. Roger claimed he had been in Colorado the entire weekend. But the records didn't lie. When confronted, Roger changed his story. He admitted he had flown to Minneapolis, but claimed he had gone to Think and had never driven to Duluth. This explanation was absurd. Minneapolis to Duluth is a 150-mile drive, and there was no reason for Roger to fly to Minneapolis just to sit in a rental car. Opportunity established. The physical evidence. Then came the most damning piece of evidence, the Byzantine gold coin. After the murders, a small package arrived at Roger and Marjorie's home in Colorado. Inside was a velvet pouch containing a gold coin that had been part of Elizabeth Congdon's collection. The coin was valuable, but not extraordinarily so, worth perhaps a few $1,000s. The package had been mailed from Duluth, Minnesota, on June 27th, the day after the murders. It was addressed to Roger Caldwell, and the return address was a fake. Police obtained a search warrant and examined the coin. Fingerprint analysis revealed a clear thumbprint on the surface of the coin. The print belonged to Roger Caldwell. Roger's explanation? He claimed he had never seen the coin before and that someone must have planted it. But this made no sense. If someone was trying to frame Roger, why would they steal a coin, handle it carefully enough to leave only Roger's print and not their own, then mail it to him from Duluth? The only logical explanation was that Roger had stolen the coin during the murders, handled it, and then mailed it to himself, possibly as a keepsake or possibly because he panicked and wanted to get it out of his possession while still in Duluth. Evidence established. The accomplice theory. But while the case against Roger seemed solid, investigators believed he hadn't acted alone. The crime required inside knowledge. The layout of the mansion, Elizabeth's routine, the staff schedule, and the location of valuables. Roger had visited Glensheen before, but only briefly. He didn't know the house well. Marjorie, on the other hand, had grown up there. She knew every room, every hallway, every lock and window. She knew when the staff would be gone. She knew where her mother slept. And she had the motive. Prosecutors theorized that Marjorie had planned the murders and instructed Roger to carry them out. But proving this in court would be much harder than convicting Roger for the physical act. The first trial, a forensic deep dive. Roger Caldwell's trial in 1978 was meticulous. The prosecution presented a timeline, backed by dozens of documents. June 26th, 10:15 a.m. Roger boards a flight in Denver. June 26th, 1:30 p.m. Roger arrives in Minneapolis, rents a car. June 26th evening, Roger drives to Duluth, 150 miles, roughly 2.5 hours. June 27th, 2 to 3 a.m. The murders occur. June 27th morning, Roger drives back to Minneapolis, returns rental car. June 27th, 11:40 a.m. Roger boards a flight back to Denver. The defense tried to poke holes in the timeline, arguing that the prosecution couldn't definitively prove Roger had been inside the mansion. But the fingerprint on the coin, combined with the travel records and Roger's suspicious injuries, was overwhelming. On July 8, 1978, Roger Caldwell was found guilty and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. The second trial, the battle over conspiracy. Marjorie's trial in 1979 was a different beast. The prosecution had circumstantial evidence, the financial desperation, the hitman inquiry, the inheritance motive, and the inside knowledge. But they had no smoking gun, no recorded conversation, no witness who could testify that Marjorie had explicitly told Roger to commit murder. Her defense attorney, Ronald Meshbesher, exploited every weakness in the prosecution's case. He argued that Roger had acted impulsively and alone. He pointed out that Marjorie had been 900 miles away at the time of the murders. He suggested that the prosecution was scapegoating Marjorie because of her family's wealth and prominence. And, crucially, he put Marjorie on the stand. She testified calmly, tearfully, insisting that she loved her mother and had nothing to do with the murders. She admitted to financial problems, but portrayed them as the result of bad luck and poor decisions, not greed or malice. The jury deliberated for 2 weeks, an extraordinarily long time. They were clearly divided. In the end, they returned a verdict of not guilty. Marjorie walked free. The aftermath, a system that failed? The acquittal of Marjorie Caldwell sparked outrage and debate. Many people felt that the justice system had failed. They believed Marjorie had orchestrated the murders and had escaped conviction through clever lawyering and a flawed legal standard for conspiracy. But others argued that the prosecution simply hadn't proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and that's the standard our legal system requires. Suspicion, no matter how strong, is not the same as proof. This tension between what people believe happened and what can be proven in court is one of the most frustrating aspects of high-profile criminal cases. And it's particularly acute in cases involving wealthy defendants who can afford top-tier legal representation. Marjorie's acquittal also highlighted the difficulty of prosecuting conspiracy cases. To convict someone of conspiracy, you generally need evidence of an agreement to commit a crime. But people don't usually write down their murder plans or discuss them in front of witnesses. Circumstantial evidence can suggest conspiracy, but it's often not enough to meet the legal burden of proof. In the years since, some legal scholars have pointed to the Glensheen case as an example of why conspiracy laws should be reformed, or why prosecutors need better tools to hold accomplices accountable. Roger's confession, truth or strategy. When Roger Caldwell confessed in 1983 as part of his plea deal, he said he had acted alone. He exonerated Marjorie completely. And on the surface, this seems like a straightforward admission of guilt. But almost no one believed him. Why would Roger take full responsibility? There are a few theories. He loved Marjorie. Despite everything, Roger may have genuinely cared for Marjorie and wanted to protect her, even at the cost of his own freedom and reputation. He was afraid of her. Some have speculated that Roger feared Marjorie, that she had manipulated or threatened him, and that even in his confession, he was still under her influence. He was promised something. Perhaps Marjorie or her lawyers had promised Roger financial support or a future together in exchange for his confession. If so, that promise was never kept. He wanted it to be over. By 1983, Roger had been in prison for 5 years. He was broken, depressed, and desperate. The plea deal offered him immediate freedom. Perhaps he simply wanted out, regardless of the long-term consequences. We'll never know the truth. Roger took it to his grave. Marjorie's arson conviction, a pattern emerges. In 1991, Marjorie was convicted of arson for setting fire to her home in Ajo, Arizona. The prosecution argued that she had set the fire to collect insurance money, a scheme eerily similar to the kind of financial desperation that had allegedly motivated the Glensheen murders. During the arson trial, the prosecution was allowed to introduce evidence about the Glensheen case, not to prove that Marjorie had been involved in the murders, she had been acquitted of that, but to establish a pattern of behavior, financial desperation leading to criminal acts. The jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. While incarcerated, Marjorie's sixth husband, Wallace Hagan, died under suspicious circumstances. Investigators looked into his death, suspecting foul play, but were unable to gather enough evidence to charge Marjorie. The case remains officially unsolved, though many believe Marjorie was involved. The children of Marjorie Caldwell. Marjorie had 7 children from her various marriages. Most of them became estranged from her over the years. Some have spoken publicly about their mother, describing a childhood marked by instability, manipulation, and fear. One of her sons, Thomas Caldwell, wrote a book about his mother titled Will to Murder, the true story behind the crimes and trials surrounding the Glensheen killings. In it, he describes growing up with Marjorie as chaotic and traumatic. He recounts incidents of bizarre behavior, financial schemes, and emotional manipulation. And he expresses his belief that his mother was responsible for the Glensheen murders. Other family members have echoed similar sentiments. They describe a woman who was charming on the surface, but deeply troubled underneath. A woman who seemed incapable of genuine empathy or remorse. A woman who left a trail of broken relationships and legal troubles wherever she went. It's a tragic legacy. Marjorie Caldwell's children grew up in the shadow of scandal and suspicion, and many have struggled to distance themselves from their mother's notoriety. Glensheen today, a living museum. While the Congdon family story is one of tragedy, Glensheen itself has thrived. Since opening to the public in 1979, the mansion has become one of Minnesota's premier historic sites. The estate is meticulously maintained by the University of Minnesota, Duluth. The rooms look much as they did when the Congdon family lived there, furnished with original pieces, decorated with period-appropriate art and textiles, and filled with artifacts from the early 20th century. The grounds are immaculate, with the formal gardens restored to their original design. Visitors can take guided tours that focus on the architecture, the history of the Congdon family, and the role of the mansion in Duluth's development. There are also specialty tours, including holiday tours, garden tours, and, yes, a murder mystery tour that delves into the events of 1977. The university has handled the murders with sensitivity. The tour guides acknowledge what happened, provide factual information, and answer questions. But they don't sensationalize the tragedy. The emphasis is on the mansion's broader historical significance, not just the crime. And it works. Glensheen attracts visitors from all over the world. School groups tour the mansion to learn about Gilded Age history and architecture. Historians and preservationists study it as an example of early 20th century design. And true crime enthusiasts visit to walk the halls where the murders took place. In a strange way, the mansion has achieved a kind of immortality. It has outlived the scandals. It has outlived the family. And it continues to tell a story, not just about wealth and murder, but about an entire era of American history. The broader legacy, what Glensheen teaches us. So what do we take from all of this? What does Glensheen, the mansion, the family, the tragedy, teach us about America, about wealth, and about human nature? First, wealth does not equal happiness or stability. Chester Congdon built a fortune and a mansion that were meant to secure his family's future for generations. But within 2 generations, that fortune became a source of conflict, desperation, and violence. Money can provide comfort and opportunity, but it can also create pressure, entitlement, and greed. The Congdon family had everything, except the thing that mattered most, peace. Second, the costs of wealth are often hidden. Chester Congdon's fortune came from the iron ore industry, an industry built on the labor of immigrant workers who endured dangerous conditions for low pay. Glensheen is beautiful, but it was built with money extracted from the earth and the people who worked it. This doesn't diminish the mansion's architectural value, but it does complicate the story. Every grand estate, every fortune, has a hidden cost. And it's worth asking, who paid it? Third, justice is imperfect. Roger Caldwell was convicted, served time, confessed, and then took his own life. Marjorie Caldwell was acquitted, lived freely for decades, and died without ever being held accountable for the murders. Velma Petala's family never received justice. Elizabeth Congdon's death remains a wound that never fully healed. The legal system did its best, but the outcome left many people unsatisfied. That's the reality of justice. It's a human process, and it's flawed. Fourth, places endure. People die. Families fall apart. Scandals fade. But places, especially places like Glensheen, endure. The mansion still stands solid and beautiful, overlooking Lake Superior. It has become a monument not just to the Congdon family, but to an entire era. And in its endurance, it reminds us that history is not just about the people who lived it, but about the places they left behind. The role of class and privilege in the case. One of the most fascinating and frustrating aspects of the Glensheen case is the role that class and privilege played in how the story unfolded. Marjorie Caldwell was not born into wealth, but she was raised in it. She was given every advantage: education, social connections, financial security. And yet, she seemed incapable of managing any of it. Her multiple marriages, financial disasters, and legal troubles suggest a person who was deeply troubled, but also someone who was repeatedly shielded from the full consequences of her actions by her family's wealth. Elizabeth Congdon bailed Marjorie out financially time and time again. The family's lawyers intervened. The trustees tried to manage her spending. And when Marjorie was finally put on trial for conspiracy, she had access to one of the best defense attorneys in the state. This raises uncomfortable questions. Would a person from a working class or poor background, accused of the same crime, have received the same treatment? Would they have been acquitted? Or would the lack of resources for a top-tier defense have led to a conviction? We can't know for sure. But the disparity in outcomes between Roger and Marjorie is striking. Roger, a man with far fewer resources and connections, was convicted quickly and sentenced to life in prison. Marjorie, a woman with wealth, family support, and an excellent lawyer, walked free. This isn't to say that Marjorie's acquittal was solely the result of privilege. The prosecution's case against her was weaker than the case against Roger. But privilege played a role. It always does. The psychological toll on the Congdon family. The Glensheen murders didn't just destroy 2 lives. They shattered an entire family. Jennifer Congdon Johnson, Marjorie's sister, had to live with the knowledge that her sibling was suspected, widely believed, to have orchestrated the murder of their mother. She had to endure the media circus, the public speculation, and the private grief. And she had to make peace with the fact that the legal system couldn't deliver the justice she sought. The extended Congdon family, cousins, nieces, nephews, also had to contend with the stigma of the scandal. The Congdon name, which had once been associated with philanthropy, business success, and social prominence, was now linked to murder. That's a burden that doesn't disappear. And then there were the children of Marjorie Caldwell, who had to grow up knowing that their mother was suspected of murdering their grandmother. Some of them cut ties with Marjorie completely. Others tried to maintain a relationship despite everything. But all of them were affected. Family trauma has a way of rippling outward, affecting not just the immediate participants, but also the next generation and the one after that. The Glensheen murders left scars that will last for decades. True crime and public fascination. The Glensheen case has become a staple of true crime media. It's been covered in books, documentaries, podcasts, and TV movies. And it's not hard to see why. The story has all the elements of a classic mystery. A grand mansion, a wealthy family, a brutal double murder, a complex legal battle, unresolved questions, and a villain who may have gotten away with it. But there's a darker side to this fascination. True crime has become a form of entertainment, and in the process, real human suffering can be trivialized or exploited. The families of Velma Petola and Elizabeth Congdon have had to watch their loved ones' deaths be turned into content, analyzed and debated by strangers, dramatized for TV audiences. This doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about cases like Glensheen. History matters. Understanding how crimes happen, how investigations unfold, and how the justice system works or doesn't is important. But it's worth remembering that behind every true crime story, there are real people who suffered real loss. Lessons in estate planning and family dynamics. From a practical standpoint, The Glensheen case offers lessons in estate planning and family dynamics, lessons that are relevant to anyone dealing with wealth, inheritance, and complicated family relationships. Lesson 1. Wealth without structure can be dangerous. Elizabeth Congdon tried to protect her daughter by setting up trust funds and limiting Marjorie's access to large sums of money. But ultimately, the promise of a massive inheritance created a deadly incentive. If Elizabeth had structured her estate differently, perhaps by leaving the bulk of her fortune to charity or by creating more restrictive trusts, the murders might never have happened. Lesson 2. Enabling troubled family members can have tragic consequences. Elizabeth loved her daughter and wanted to help her, but by repeatedly bailing Marjorie out financially, she may have enabled Marjorie's worst behaviors. She shielded Marjorie from the consequences of her actions, which allowed the destructive patterns to continue and escalate. This is an agonizing dilemma for any parent. How do you help a troubled child without enabling them? Where do you draw the line? And at what point do you have to prioritize your own safety and well-being? Lesson 3. Security measures matter. The Congdon family received a credible warning that Marjorie was seeking to harm Elizabeth. They increased security at Glensheen, but it wasn't enough. In hindsight, perhaps they should have taken more drastic measures, hired full-time security, installed alarm systems, or even moved Elizabeth to a different, more secure location. But these are the kinds of decisions that are easy to judge in hindsight and agonizingly difficult to make in the moment. The intersection of mental illness and crime. Another layer to this story is the question of mental illness. Marjorie Caldwell's behavior, chronic lying, financial recklessness, lack of empathy, impulsivity, suggests a possible personality disorder. But she was never officially diagnosed, at least not publicly, and she was deemed competent to stand trial. This raises complex ethical questions. If Marjorie did have a personality disorder, should she be held to the same standard of moral responsibility as someone without one? Does understanding the psychological factors behind criminal behavior change our view of justice and punishment? There are no easy answers, but these questions are worth grappling with, especially as our understanding of psychology and neuroscience continues to evolve. The environmental and historical context. It's also worth placing the Glensheen case in its broader environmental and historical context. The mansion was built during the height of the Gilded Age, a period of extreme economic inequality in America. Industrialists and financiers amassed enormous fortunes, often through the exploitation of labor and natural resources. Chester Congdon's wealth came from iron ore, a resource that was literally ripped out of the earth. The mining industry transformed the landscape of northern Minnesota, creating wealth for a few and jobs, often dangerous, low-paying jobs, for many. And the environmental impact was significant. Deforestation, water pollution, and scarred landscapes. Glensheen, then, is not just a beautiful mansion. It's a monument to an economic system that concentrated wealth at the top and extracted value from the land and labor below. The mansion's beauty is real, but so is the cost. This doesn't mean we should tear down Glensheen or stop appreciating it, but it does mean we should look at it with clear eyes, understanding both what it represents and what it obscures. Comparisons to other Gilded Age estates. Glensheen is often compared to other Gilded Age estates, such as the Vanderbilt's Biltmore in North Carolina, the Rockefellers' Kykuit in New York, and the Hearst Castle in California. All of these mansions were built by enormously wealthy families during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. All of them are now museums, preserved for their architectural and historical significance. But Glensheen is unique in one key way. It's smaller and more intimate than many of its peers. Biltmore has 178,000 square feet. Hearst Castle has 90,000. Glensheen has just 27,000. It was never meant to be the biggest or the most ostentatious. It was meant to be elegant, refined, and livable, a family home, not just a showpiece. And that intimacy makes the tragedy even more poignant. This wasn't a distant, impersonal palace. It was a home where real people lived, loved, and ultimately died. The role of gender in the case. Another important dimension to consider is the role of gender in how Marjorie Caldwell was perceived, both during the investigation and at trial. Marjorie was a woman accused of conspiracy to commit murder, a crime that required cunning, manipulation, and cold calculation. But she was also able to present herself as sympathetic, even vulnerable. During her trial, Marjorie famously knitted in the courtroom. This image, a middle-aged woman, calmly knitting while being accused of orchestrating her mother's murder, became iconic. Some saw it as a sign of her composure and innocence. Others saw it as a calculated performance, designed to humanize her and make her seem non-threatening. Her defense attorney, Ronald Meshbesher, leaned into traditional gender stereotypes, portraying Marjorie as a troubled woman rather than a calculating criminal. He suggested that Roger, the man, had acted impulsively and violently, while Marjorie, the woman, was passive and uninvolved. This strategy worked. The jury acquitted her. But it raises questions. Would a male defendant, accused of the same crime and using the same defense strategy, have been acquitted? Or did Marjorie benefit from gendered assumptions about women, that they are less capable of violence, more emotional, and less threatening? There's no definitive answer. But the Glensheen case is a reminder that gender, like class and race, can influence how we perceive guilt, innocence, and culpability. The impact on Duluth and the local community. The Glensheen murders also had a profound impact on the city of Duluth and the local community. Duluth is a relatively small city. Its population in 1977 was around 100,000. The Congdon family was one of the most prominent families in the city's history. Chester Congdon had helped build Duluth's economy, and the family had been active in local philanthropy and civic life for generations. When the murders happened, it was a shocking, traumatic event for the entire community. People who had worked for the Congdon family, who had known Elizabeth Congdon personally, who had toured Glensheen or attended events there, all of them were affected. And then came the media circus. National news crews descended on Duluth. The city was suddenly in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. The trials became local obsessions, with residents following every detail, debating the evidence, and taking sides. In the years since, Duluth has had to reckon with the legacy of the case. The city is proud of Glensheen. It's a major tourist attraction and a source of civic pride. But the murders are an inescapable part of that story. The mansion is beautiful, but it's also haunted by tragedy. The question of redemption. One of the most difficult questions raised by the Glensheen case is the question of redemption. Can someone like Marjorie Caldwell be redeemed? And if so, what would that even look like? Marjorie lived for more than 40 years after the murders. She was convicted of arson and fraud. She served time in prison. Her children became estranged from her. She died alone, with few people mourning her passing. But as far as we know, she never expressed genuine remorse for what happened at Glensheen. She never admitted to any involvement in the murders. She never sought forgiveness from her family or from the families of the victims. In the absence of remorse or accountability, can there be redemption? Or is redemption only possible when the person acknowledges their wrongdoing and attempts to make amends? These are theological and philosophical questions, but they're also deeply human ones. And they're questions that many people who followed the case continue to wrestle with. The legal reforms sparked by the case. In the years following the Glensheen murders and trials, there were calls for legal reforms, particularly around conspiracy laws and the rights of victims' families in criminal cases. Some legal scholars argued that the standard for proving conspiracy was too high and that it allowed guilty parties to escape justice. They suggested reforms that would make it easier to convict accomplices, even in the absence of direct evidence of an explicit agreement. Others argued that the trials highlighted the need for better victim advocacy. Velma Petala's family, in particular, received little attention or support during the legal proceedings. Victims' rights organizations use the case as an example of why families of crime victims need more resources, more information, and more of a voice in the justice process. It's unclear whether the Glensheen case directly led to specific legal changes. but it contributed to broader conversations about justice, accountability, and the rights of victims, conversations that continue today. The preservation of Glensheen, a model for historic sites. On a more positive note, Glensheen has become a model for how to preserve and manage historic estates. The University of Minnesota Duluth has done an exemplary job of maintaining the property, restoring original features, and creating educational programming that goes beyond simple tours. The estate offers programs on architecture, horticulture, history, and even culinary arts, highlighting the mansion's kitchens and the role of domestic staff. It hosts community events, weddings, and educational workshops. And it has become a center for scholarship on Gilded Age history and historic preservation. This is important work. Historic sites like Glensheen are not just tourist attractions. They're educational resources, cultural touchstones, and links to the past. By preserving and interpreting them thoughtfully, we ensure that future generations can learn from them. The ongoing public interest. Decades after the murders, public interest in the Glensheen case remains strong. Online forums, Reddit threads, and true crime communities continue to discuss the case, analyze the evidence, and debate Marjorie's guilt or innocence. Some people believe Marjorie orchestrated the murders and that the justice system failed. Others believe Roger acted alone, driven by his own desperation. Still others think there may have been additional parties involved, perhaps hired killers or accomplices who were never identified. The truth is, we'll probably never know the full story. Roger is dead. Marjorie is dead. The physical evidence has been analyzed and reanalyzed. The legal proceedings are over. All that's left are the questions. And maybe that's part of what makes the case so compelling. It resists easy answers. It forces us to sit with ambiguity, uncertainty, and the uncomfortable reality that justice is not always tidy. Reflections on family, wealth, and tragedy. At its core, the Glensheen case is a story about family, about the bonds that connect us, and the ways those bonds can fray and break, about the hopes parents have for their children, and the pain that comes when those hopes are dashed, about the complicated legacy of wealth, and the ways it can both protect and destroy. Elizabeth Congdon loved her daughter. She tried to help her, to support her, to give her every chance to succeed. But in the end, that love wasn't enough. It couldn't overcome Marjorie's demons, whatever they were. It couldn't prevent the tragedy that unfolded on June 27, 1977. And that's heartbreaking, because it reminds us that love, no matter how deep, cannot always save us. That family, no matter how strong, can break. That wealth, no matter how great, cannot shield us from pain, loss, or violence. What Glensheen represents today. Today, Glensheen stands as a complex symbol. It represents the grandeur and ambition of the Gilded Age. It represents the vision and success of Chester Congdon. It represents the beauty of early 20th century architecture and craftsmanship. But it also represents tragedy, scandal, and the dark side of wealth and family. Visitors to Glensheen today walk through rooms that once hosted elegant parties and family gatherings. They admire the oak woodwork, the stained glass, the formal gardens. And many of them also think about what happened here. They imagine the night of June 27, 1977. They picture Velma Petola on the staircase, fighting for her life. They picture Elizabeth Congdon in her bed, unable to defend herself. The mansion does not shy away from this history. The tour guides acknowledge it. The museum materials address it. And in doing so, Glensheen becomes more than just a beautiful building. It becomes a place where we can reflect on the full complexity of human experience, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the tragic, the aspirations and the failures, the unsolved mysteries that remain. Even after all these years, some questions about the Glensheen case remain unanswered. Did Marjorie explicitly order the murders? The evidence strongly suggests she was involved, but there is no definitive proof. Why did Roger mail the gold coin to himself? Was it a trophy? A mistake? An act of carelessness? We'll never know. Was anyone else involved? Some have speculated that there may have been a third party, perhaps a hired accomplice. But no evidence has ever emerged to support this theory. What did Marjorie know, and when did she know it? Even if she didn't directly order the murders, did she have advanced knowledge? Did she suspect what Roger was planning? Did she encourage him, or simply fail to stop him? These questions will likely never be answered, but they continue to fuel discussion and debate. The ethical responsibility of storytelling. As we tell and retell stories like Glensheen, we have an ethical responsibility to do so thoughtfully and respectfully. True crime is not just entertainment. It's a genre that deals with real human suffering. And the way we frame these stories matters. We should honor the victims. We should be cautious about sensationalizing violence. We should avoid turning real people into caricatures or villains. And we should be honest about what we know and what we don't know. In the case of Glensheen, we know that 2 women were murdered. We know that the legal system convicted one person and acquitted another. We know that questions remain. And we know that the tragedy left deep scars on a family and a community. That's the story. It's messy, unresolved, and painful. But it's also important because it teaches us about the complexities of justice, the fragility of family, and the ways that wealth and desperation can collide with devastating consequences. Final reflections. The Glensheen murders happened nearly 50 years ago. The main figures in the case, Elizabeth Congdon, Velma Petola, Roger Caldwell, Marjorie Caldwell, are all dead. The legal proceedings are long over. And yet, the case continues to resonate. Why? Because it touches on themes that are universal and timeless. Family, money, power, greed, justice, and the human capacity for both love and violence. It reminds us that no amount of wealth can guarantee safety or happiness. It reminds us that family bonds can be both sustaining and destructive. It reminds us that justice is imperfect, and that sometimes the truth remains elusive. And it reminds us that places like Glensheen, beautiful, historic, carefully preserved, carry within them the full weight of history. The triumphs and the tragedies, the light and the dark. Glensheen still stands, overlooking Lake Superior, a monument to an era, a family, and a crime that shocked a nation. It's a place of beauty. It's a place of tragedy. And it's a place that asks us to remember, to reflect, and to grapple with the uncomfortable truths about who we are and what we're capable of. Epilogue. The mansion endures. As the sun sets over Lake Superior, casting long shadows across the lawns of Glensheen, the mansion remains. The gardens bloom each spring. The tours continue each summer. The rooms are preserved. The history is told. Inside, the grand staircase still stands, the same staircase where Velma Petola fought for her life. The bedroom where Elizabeth Congdon died remains, now part of the tour route. And visitors walk through, some curious, some somber, all of them aware that they are standing in a place where history, both beautiful and terrible, unfolded. Glensheen has outlived the scandal. It has outlived the family. And it will outlive us all. Because in the end, buildings endure longer than people. And places like Glensheen become repositories of memory, holding not just the stories of those who built them, but also the stories of those who suffered within them. The mansion stands as a testament to ambition, craftsmanship, wealth, and tragedy. It stands as a reminder that behind every grand estate, there are hidden costs. And it stands as a question: what do we choose to preserve? What do we choose to remember? And how do we reckon with the darkness that sometimes lies beneath the surface of beauty? These are the questions Glensheen asks us. And they are questions worth asking. The mansion endures. The story endures. And the lessons about family, wealth, justice, and the human condition endure with it.